Hello, everyone. In case you don't know, I actually published my novel, my debut supernatural horror novel last month or last year in September 2024. And I actually ended up going on a kind of book tour uh, event. So I went to different places around Saskatchewan, as well as did some kind of other readings that I was invited to do. So I thought today I might just do a video version that I'll upload to my YouTube, as well as put some clips onto my social media, just so that you can kind of get a taste of the readings that I had done. So again, this is for Coma, my supernatural horror novel. So Coma kind of follows three different perspectives. The first perspective is Stan, which is the main character, and he has fallen into a coma, if you couldn't have guessed. So yeah, they have end up having an accident, and he ends up falling into a coma, and which then transport his subconscious kind of to a different realm. And so he wakes up in this other realm and doesn't know where he is, and he has to kind of navigate his way back. Now, unfortunately for him, that other realm turns out to not be only him there. So that is kind of what happens to him. Then there's also the perspective of Liz. Liz is his wife, and so she was actually there when the accident happened. So she knows that that Stan is hurt and in a coma. And but it also kind of follows her perspective because they are parents of three children. So she has to become not only the breadwinner of the household while he is in a coma, but also has to take care of the children and make sure that things are, going back to normal kind of thing. And then the third perspective that you meet later on in the book is of Serafine. And Serafine is Stan's nurse in the long term care unit. And it all takes place in Vancouver, British Columbia area. So that's kind of about the book. Now, a lot of times I hear about, my what brought me to actually write the book. So I kind of started the idea of the book back in 2020, I think is when it actually hit. And it's funny because it actually started because of the book On Writing by Stephen King, which I probably have somewhere here in my shelf. But yeah, so that was actually the reason why I wrote Coma specifically. I was reading through On Writing by Stephen King, and this idea came to me of, what if somebody fell into a coma and some dark entities in the shadows kind of, became interested in him, and what would that look like? So that is where Coma kind of came from. So in the reading that I'm going to do kind of today is I'll introduce you to each of the three characters. I'll kind of read a section from each of them for you so that you can kind of get a sense of who they are. I've also put a PDF of the first couple of chapters on my website, so sample chapters, in case you want to, read it for yourself. But first I will just kind of read a few of these pages. So this is Stan. This is the first chapter, and it'll just kind of introduce you to Stan and get you kind of into what happens that puts him into the coma. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Stan and his wife Liz walked along the sidewalk toward their home. It was their routine, their time to be alone while the nanny Jules got their three young boys ready for bed. The sun was setting in the distance over the park as they climbed the last hill, nearly reaching the final curve that would take them to their street. Although they did this every weeknight, he huffed a little from the exertion. Holding hands, they discussed the upcoming hockey season for their oldest son, Alex. "Do you think he's old enough to go into the dressing room alone?" Liz asked. "He can tie his own shoes. I feel like he should be able to tie his own skates by now." "What, you don't want to enjoy the aroma of sweaty hockey funk for another year?" Stan laughed. "Won't you miss it?" Liz pushed into him with her shoulder, a smile growing across her face. "Fine, you go in and help him if you enjoy it so much." Before Stan could reply with sarcasm, the screeching tires of a truck interrupted them, rounding the nearby corner too fast. At first, it didn't feel significant to him. The bright lights approaching him made him momentarily think of a big steel UFO. He still felt no indication of any danger. Then the truck jumped the curb in front of them. In his peripheral vision, Stan saw Liz freeze like an animal caught in the headlights. It all happened so fast. His only thought in that split second was Liz needs to move. Breaking where their hands held, he turned and pushed her hard, just as the lights reached them. Her surprised face fell outside the beams cast by the bright light. Her hands reaching out toward him, and then everything went black. At first, the blackness was quiet, peaceful. Then came the noise. An awful noise. Someone screamed nearby at first, but it quickly changed, morphing into a more hollow, animalistic sound. The type you expect to hear in horror movies when banshees are running through the forest. It made his skin crawl. He couldn't open his eyes. Maybe it was for the best. He wasn't sure he wanted to see the source of that wail. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. New sensations passed over his body as he lay still in the blackness. A burning slowly spread across his body, as though his insides had been lit on fire. The flames were trying to burst out to reach the oxygen around him, licking his skin from the inside. Stan couldn't remember seeing any fire, only the bright lights. So why am I burning? Okay, so the second chapter. So this chapter kind of introduces you to Liz. And so, like I said, Liz is Stan's wife in the book. And she is having to take care of their three children while he is in a coma. And she doesn't know that what's going on in this coma, but she does know that things are starting to happen around her that are making her wonder what's happening here. So here's a section from Liz. And when we're coming into this, she's just gotten to work and she's accidentally spilt some coffee on her outfit because while she was driving, she had to slam her brakes for a red light and spilt coffee all over her clothes. And she works in a newspaper office in North Vancouver. So this is kind of the start of that. She just got into her office and she's looking at herself in the mirror. Good morning, hot mess. Coffee stains had spread across her white blouse. She shook her head and walked over to the closet in the back corner of her small office space to pull out her spare suit. She carried it out to the bathroom near the common area. As she walked into the shadowy bathroom, she flicked on the light switch. Nothing happened. Oh, come on. She flicked the switch up and down repeatedly. Nothing happened. I guess I'm changing in the dark. She shrugged her shoulders and walked over to the counter. Someone had left a nightlight plugged into the wall above the bathroom sink, casting a faint yellow glow. There was no way she was changing in the toilet stall. It would be pitch black. She quickly removed her stained clothing, carefully folding them and placing them on the counter before picking up her other suit. As she looked at her reflection, she realized even her white bra had coffee splashed across the front of it. She brushed at it. Great, she muttered. As she pulled her new blue blouse over her shoulders, the toilet flushed in the stall behind her. She spun around. The door was open a few inches, but she couldn't see the toilet itself. Is someone there? Pulling her blouse closed over her chest, she reached out and slowly opened the bathroom stall door. Her heart pounded in her chest, making her blood drum in her ears. The room felt freezing. Goosebumps spread over her skin and the hair on the back of her neck rose. As the stall door opened more, it squealed in complaint. She could barely see the white toilet glowing in the small space. Dark black shadows covered the black wall and floor behind the toilet, but no one was there. Okay, the toilet is just acting up, that's all. She turned back to her clothes on the counter by the sink. Liz threw her legs into the pants before buttoning her shirt. She didn't want to be in this room alone anymore. As she began buttoning up her blouse, the nightlight flickered, dimming slightly. She thought she saw movement behind her in the mirror's reflection. She wouldn't admit it to herself, but a light breeze seemed to pass over the back of her neck. Okay, so this next chapter that I'm going to be doing reading for you is actually where you get to meet Serafine. So, like I said, Seraphine in Coma is the nurse. So, she is Stan's nurse. Stan is the main character who falls into the coma, and Seraphine is the nurse that works in the long term care unit. And you kind of get to learn a little bit about Seraphine's past and what kind of makes her more susceptible to understanding the paranormal and weird experiences happening around Stan. So when we come into this, we're coming into Seraphine inside of the hospital, and she's in Stan's room, and she just had Liz, Stan's wife, in the room with her, and Stan's eyes had involuntarily opened, so they're staring up at the ceiling. So this is where we're coming in. Is Liz now left, and Seraphine is alone. Stan's eyes continued to stare up at the ceiling. The whites around his pupils shone as if frozen in terror. A sense of foreboding gripped Seraphine. His face brought up memories of her mother, teaching her about the signs of possession. Seraphine reluctantly reached out, placing her hand over his eyes. His skin was cold and clammy against her warm fingers. At first, his eyelids refused to budge, but she wasn't giving up. Gripping her fingertips onto his eyelids, she pulled them down. She took a step back and dropped her hand to her side, sighing with relief. With his eyes closed, he looked like he was sleeping peacefully. Seraphine made a final note on the clipboard and placed it back in its placeholder before leaving the room. He's not possessed. He's in a coma. Once the door clicked shut behind her, she walked toward the nurse's station. The hallway was eerily quiet, but it was getting late, so she wasn't overly surprised. She sat down at the desk and pulled her romance novel from the drawer to read. The lights overhead flickered before turning off. The hall lights continued to shine through the small window above the desk. Well, that's odd. She stood back up to move into the hall. As she passed over the threshold of the small office, the lights began flickering in the hall. They changed from a bright white glare to a murky gray. What's going on with these lights? It was faint, but she could hear humming from somewhere down the hall. Walking towards the sound, she paused at each door she passed, pressing her ear against them to find the source of the hum. As she approached room 136, the humming grew louder. Of course, it's his room. Reaching out, she placed her hand on the cold metal of the door handle. It vibrated ominously against her skin. She took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping into the room. The hospital room was gone. Instead, a dull gray sky was overhead. The walls were replaced by tall, dark shadows dancing around the hospital bed where Stan lay. In a panic, she turned back to the hall, but more shadows hovered behind her, only inches away. The hall was gone. The doorframe seemed to stand on its own with no walls to hold its weight. She backed away from the shadows as they bubbled and churned around her. The humming was right behind her now, so she turned. The hospital bed was gone, along with Stan's body. Instead, a man huddled in a ball on the black floor at her feet, his arms covering his face. His body was blurred around the edges, making him look like a wet painting that hadn't quite dried yet. The man was the source of the humming, curled over his knees, fingers plugging his ears. Seraphine reached out to touch his shoulder. Does he know where we are? As soon as her fingers made contact, the man startled. Looking up into her face, immediately she recognized the wide, scared eyes staring up at her. It was Stan. Something was wrong with his face, though. It was longer and skinnier than she remembered, the skin seeming to hang off the bone. Stan opened his mouth as if to scream, but his chin kept getting longer, his mouth opening unnaturally long into a long oval shape. His human teeth transformed, melting and lengthening as if made of clay. Long, sharp fangs protruded at angles all over his enlarged mouth. The back of his throat was black, like a giant hole. She tried to step back, but an invisible force pulled her body toward him. His mouth had a force of gravity as it continued to spread wider. His head tilted back wide like a giant snake, and she was pulled headfirst into it. His throat constricted around her and became tighter and darker as she was dragged in further and further. She tried to open her mouth to scream or cover her face with her hands, but the hole was too tight. Her arms were trapped at her sides, unable to move. Her lungs felt like they were being squeezed flat, making it difficult to breathe. Serafine closed her eyes, hoping the end of this torture would come soon. Enveloped in darkness, gravelly, deep voices began to speak all around her. She couldn't understand their language, but they were angry. They were growing louder. Whoever they belonged to was getting closer, trying to catch up to her. All right. Again, this is all from Coma, my debut supernatural horror novel. If you'd like to check it out, it is on everything, Amazon, and you can get it on my website. If you're in Canada, I can send you a signed copy, or Pete's Press. You can find it a few different places. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think, and thank you for listening.